Hello again. I shall begin with the Venice Charter of 1964. It, in a sense, heralded the advent of modern heritage conservation in Europe as we now understand it. I shall frame my remarks against the uneasy relationship that obtains between architecture, art history, and restoration, and explore whether the Charter is still a useful compass capable of guiding restorers through a confusing landscape with its plethora of terms, academic courses, and ethical and practical approaches. When I deal here with the terms restoration and conservation, I have to be aware, this is most of you will know this 1950s photograph of a crucifixes lying down on the stairs of a church being cleaned by a woman with water, as often shown as a slide in speeches like this. This one would be kind of a modern version of that image and showing that it's going on this kind of restoration conservation. It's still among us. When I deal here with the terms restoration and conservation, I have to be aware the remarkable different meanings these terms carry in different languages. Restoration does not mean the same in Great Britain than Restaurierung means in Austria, Switzerland, and Germany, for example. Similar shifts of meaning may apply to that and similar terms in French, Italian, Spanish, and other European languages. Despite this, I attempt to undergo the task and deal with meanings, for I'm convinced our success and defeats are tightly linked to the fact how much the profession is understood or misunderstood in public and professional circles of different or even the same tongues. Our problems begin with the first sentence of Article 9 of Venice Charter. While the English version reads, "The process of restoration is a highly specialized operation," the German text translates back into English as, "The process of restoration is an intervention that should remain an exception." Note, in 1964, both languages used the term restoration still. Let us explore the context in which the term restoration occurs. You'll notice that that alone in the German discourse, over the last 100 years, several different meanings and contents have been transported. So first to the use in German. One is the traditional meaning favored by the German art historian and founding father of Denkmalpflege, its conservation of monuments institution, Georg de Hio. Here it is defined in opposition to conservation, as in the contradiction, conservation, not restoration. This would appear to be the implication of the first sentence of Article 9, particularly in the French, Italian, and German versions. So in the following, I show some pictures taken in my professional practice. Hence, they are all linked to wall painting, conservation, or architecture surface. So I'm sorry for missing out the other specializations in doing so. Now, this meaning or this use of the term restoration would suggest that the main purpose of restoration is to add a particular monument with a view to rendering it complete. No doubt, extensive reinterpretations of monuments should always be the exception. Indeed, such an approach, which was already considered problematic 100 years ago, has largely been abandoned by modern heritage conservation practitioners. But are we really aware of the implications of these views of the present day? Georg de Hio, Alois Riegel, and kindred spirits clearly referred to interventions carried out to preserve our cultural heritage in this way as Restauration, and this kind of old-fashioned German term does indeed provide an accurate description thereof. Secondly, the modern German term Restaurierung is used today as an umbrella for all of the conservation restoration interventions carried out on works of art and cultural assets. The conservation share in it is what we would understand as preservation, including the preventive conservation, or to say the passing of the substance and historical aesthetic values of works of art to next generations. Restoration in that context would be a somewhat deeper intervention, aimed to make works of art more accessible, as I'll mention later. Again, in this, let me put Middle European sense, restoration covers both sides and meanings. In German, Restaurator, Restorateurin is used to refer to the associated profession, unlike in English, for example, which favors the term conservator. In some European countries, as in Switzerland among others, extended to Conservator-Restorer, as E.C.C.O carries it in its name as subtitle. Indeed, the conservation dimension has come very much to the fore in the recent decades in the sense of preserving the authenticity of works of art. Nevertheless, we stuck to Restaurator, Restorer in German, till yet for two reasons, despite our being aware of international, partly different usage. The first reason is, and then with Mr. Hudson-Etter in the morning, fully, the first reason is the use of the term conservator as a title of curators in museums and officers in public service for preservation of historical monuments in Germany. Secondly, in the very moment German Conservator-Restorers would abandon the term Restaurator, predictably the craftsmanship organizations and others willingly would take the opportunity to fill it with their own complete divergent meanings and messages. Thirdly, restoration, Restaurierung, also refers to a subset of the activities involved in conservation restoration, as I mentioned above. Specifically, it describes practices designed to make works of art decipherable, once more by actively using academic and scientific disciplines such as art technology, material science, and restoration history to reveal their original intentions. It's true that restorers with academic qualification also work with their hands, developing a form of manual intelligence, much a kind of that of a skilled surgeon. However, and I think this needs not to be said, it is totally absurd to use this argument to classify restorers as craftsmen or women. Their work goes further, similar to the example of the surgeon whose contribution to a patient's cure is not confined to the sawing of bones. Fourthly, the term restoration is increasingly used by media, especially in Germany, and the public to refer to any intervention performed on a historic monument. This usage often crops up in references to the restoration of a particular castle, museum, and covers indiscriminately the work of architects, engineers, and craftsmen alike. By including activities that could more accurately be described as renovation, repair work, or restoring functionality, it effectively downplays the significance of specialized conservation restoration work. Then, can the Venice Charter help us with our understanding of the term? Article 9 shows that the two German terms, the old-fashioned Restauration, that would meet the English restoration, and Restaurierung in the sense of the today English conservation, despite meaning virtually the opposite, were already competing with each other back in 1964 and were sometimes used interchangeably from one sentence to the next. The aforementioned opening sentence of Article 9 leads on to the following observations on the nature of restoration. It's now quotation Venice Charter. The restoration's aim is to preserve and reveal the aesthetic and historic value of the monument and is based on a respect for the original material and authentic documents. It must stop at the point where conjecture begins. To some extent, sentences 2 to 4 of Article 9 cancel out the meaning of the first sentence. If the professionals involved in heritage conservation were to heed what they say, they could not argue for restoration to be treated as an exception, as an umbrella term covering all good conservation and restoration work. It could and maybe should be used to refer to standard good heritage management practice. In this, and only in this sense, we will stick to the term in German, whether we like it or not, for a little longer. Besides this, little by little, the term Conservierung, Restaurierung finds its way into practical use in Germany too. For example, designating the courses and the related graduations of our profession on universities. In this paper, I will stick in the following to the eco-style conservation-restoration, whilst referring to the German Restaurierung, as a synonymous term in the aforementioned sense. I already discussed the manual skills indispensable for the profession. What about the creative part, which mattered a lot in the early years when merely painters carried out the treatments? Today, on exceptional occasions, a heritage management approach may be adopted, which calls for a creative design concept, as is the case, for instance, in competitions. This type of approach requires all actors to exercise particular care and discipline in planning and could more accurately be described as monument development rather than conservation. After all, modern conservation restoration is in itself diametrically opposed to creative design, a view we would now hold thanks to the process that began shortly after Venice. This marked the start of a more and eventually more academic approach to the training of conservators, with a proliferation of new courses of study and the emergence of quality assurance through continuing professional development delivered by higher education institutions and professional bodies, not least E.C.C.O. Conservation restoration. By the way, it's Neues Museum. Some of the images are taken during conservation restoration of Neues Museum, showing colleagues in the middle of business. Conservation restoration involves exploring the aesthetic and historical values of original material and interrogating the cultural asset of historic monuments. That's the core of the profession, and it makes clear that it has very little to do with craftsmanship. Dialogue with art historians, building researchers, architects and scientists at museums and in the heritage conservation can provide a stimulating source of ideas. As Conservator-Restorers will take their own individual decisions, informed by a personal dialogue with the neighboring disciplines, they may arrive at different outcomes. Nonetheless, it should be plain to all concerned that certain ethical and scientific guardrails, call it professional standards, are in place for conservation work. The word design, when used to refer to a conservation plan, does not in any way have the same meaning as it would for an architect. That is why we have star architects, but no star restorers, or do we have? However, no such thing as the conservation of a complex building, museum or collection has ever actually existed. In such cases, the final result is the sum of many individual restoration interventions and numerous details of the building's interior and exterior. Moreover, it also includes work carried out by other professions. And it should not really be called conservation at all, but rather supplementary remediation, ergänzende Wiederherstellung, a term coined in an article written in 1992 in respect of the planned re-erection of Neues Museum. The attempt to impose the term in a wider sense has been partly intended to control the outcomes of conservation work for practical planning, financial or aesthetic reasons, amongst others. However, in conservation work, not every single step can be planned from start to finish. In contrast, it's rather the significance of that process not to be foreseeable in all its consequences. Unexpected issues may arise during the course of work, requiring ongoing consultations with curators and future users. If you take the Venice Charter and its call for the respect of original material literally, we must reflect on what precisely constitutes original material that we are required to respect. Is it a dirty, overgrown, spoiled and neglected state that we may find a property today? Or cite one prominent example from the recent past when a number of conservation interventions were carried out on the Neues Museum in Berlin, which many of us visited and indeed enjoyed yesterday night. Chipperfield architects went one step further and used principles of conservation restoration as their leitmotif in building development. Can it be that we are in the midst of a revolution then? True, any kind of development work, even in the sphere of monuments, we are dealing with still involves creative design, and this is no doubt the core business of architects. However, whether this is really the best way to enable the original intentions to be deciphered, as the Venice Charter demands, is a moot point. Unfortunately, the Charter clearly fails to provide a convincing argument either way. Are we to respect the aesthetic appearance designed by the original architect, or that of the ruin we see before us today? If restoration is to be based on respect for original material, does this mean it's more respectful to leave what remains of the original, or perhaps we must recreate an impression of the original setting while being careful to distinguish between parts that belong to the original and those that have been added later? In every single case, this will remain a tricky task. According to what was written down in Venice half a century ago, restoration must stop at the point where conjecture begins. This statement is extremely interesting and somewhat problematic to disentangle. It is quite clearly intended to prevent excessive speculative additions to the remains of any artwork in an attempt to render it complete. But what if the very act of leaving things as they are, that means not restoring them, were to create a false impression of these original intentions? This gives some measure of the complexity and contradictions inherent in any attempt to arrive at a correct interpretation of the Charter. If conservation teams are to resolve complex problems such as these, they are duty-bound to include specialists of their own profession who have been trained to the highest academic standards. Is heritage conservation art? This question is hardly new. Do our historic buildings and monuments really need to be reinterpreted and acquire an additional level of meaning or design as the result of a creative process? In my sense, certainly not. The role of heritage conservation and the job of the Conservator-Restorer fulfill a very different, albeit complementary purpose. They both provide us with the opportunity to study the past through authentically preserved works of architecture and art from times gone by. Conservators-Restorers need to go far beyond the veneer of vintage charm. Their job is to research the history of the object, the original intentions of its creator, the materials from which it is made, and how best these can be preserved. What is in vogue today may well be dated tomorrow. What an artist intended to express when creating a work, perhaps as long as 500 years ago, must never be subject to the vagaries of fashion. It should never suffer the superimposition of our fleeting preferences for practical or aesthetic reasons. So I have already mentioned Berlin's Neues Museum. We enjoyed so much. Few would dispute that this project, with its priority on structural preservation, has been a success. However, it remains, no wonder, an isolated example. In the case, the principle of holding competitions for heritage projects may become widespread. What could happen? Would architects in heritage conservation feel pressurized by the need to complete the project with a minimum of hindrance and hire workers who would be pliable and unencumbered by academic training? Does heritage conservation really need more compliant minions then? Quite the reverse, I dare say. It needs people who are able to correct mistakes. One of the greatest accomplishments of heritage conservation in Germany and Europe over the past 3 decades has been to introduce an academic approach to conservation, and how much did E.C.C.O contribute to this? Let us cherish this achievement. We cannot allow it to be challenged or spoiled by economic interests or blatant attempts at lobbying. Architects, craftsmen, art historians and engineers all have their own particular part to play in the huge challenge we face in preserving cultural heritage. However, we also need to clear up the confusion surrounding certain terms, and it has been one of the aims of my paper today. This confusion may come from ignorance or from premeditation. In neither case, it will lead to any good. I wish I've been able to shed a little light onto this complex subject. I ran the risk to bore you with all these terms only because conservation matters, as the title of our today's E.C.C.O Jubilee Convention reads. Oh, it's the sun. The fact that Conservator-Restorers have now definitely added academic credentials to their professional status is of benefit to historical buildings, monuments, and indeed works of art in general. It opens up new avenues for research and preservation in this field. It is also clearly to the advantage of society as a whole, which has an outspoken interest in having its fine cultural heritage well preserved. The conservator's job description has undergone a fundamental transformation now that a higher education qualification is required to access the profession. As the Venice Charter itself describes restoration as a highly specialized measure, there can no be doubt that it belongs in the hands of specialists. That's us. Therefore, I congratulate you again. I congratulate all presidents of the European Conservator-Restorers associations. I congratulate E.C.C.O as our European umbrella organization. The VDR considers itself happy to be part of it. Thank you.